listener production.
Hello, happy Monday and welcome to The Briefing. Sasha Barbagat with you. 1 in 2 of us have it, some of us rely on it, but others barely use it. I'm talking about private health insurance, and it's in the wake of news we'll be footing another massive premium increase.
Health funds are doing pretty well, and it's pretty rough when you're getting a 5% increase on your policy, on a policy which a lot of us never really use.
A deep dive into the latest increase in private health insurance, why we're fronting the price hike, and the simple ways we can save on our policy is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spyrou. It is Monday, the 23rd of February.
Morning, Sash, and welcome to another week of news. And discussions around the so-called ISIS brides are looking like they will continue this week as the coalition proposes new legislation to make it harder for them to return. Opposition leader Angus Taylor has announced the bill which would make it illegal to help people with links to terror organisations to return to Australia, and that would mean prosecuting people and organisations.
It comes as a group of 34 women and children attempt to come back to Australia from Syria with a fight here on home soil about whether they should be granted passports. Just one member of the group has been denied, something the Home Affairs Minister has defended.
There are very different people within that cohort with different histories and different states of mind, if I put it in those terms. They are quite different, but our agencies have been following them.
That was Tony Burke on the ABC. He's also insisted the government is not helping in any way with their repatriation.
But the opposition thinks the government isn't going far enough and should be denying these women and children passports.
Under the Passports Act, very clear that the government can refuse a passport to an Australian citizen if they receive advice from a competent authority like ASIO or the AFP that that person is a threat to security and that denying their passport would deal with that threat to security.
That was Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson there on Sky in response to Anthony Albanese's comments earlier yesterday that the government has to issue citizens with passports.
When it comes to the issue of citizenship, that has rights as well. Under our Constitution, there are issues there, and the Coalition know that that is the case, and we're operating on the same basis.
The Coalition's Shadow Cabinet met yesterday to approve the bill, but it is yet to be published in full, and there's no word yet on when it will be introduced to Parliament.
To developing news in the US now, where Secret Service agents have this morning shot and killed an armed man who was trying to break into Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago club and residence in Florida. According to authorities, this man was in his early 20s and was carrying a gas can and a shotgun when he was spotted inside the gates.
He was ordered to drop those two pieces of equipment that he had with him, at which time he put down the gas can, raised the shotgun to a shooting position. At that point in time, the deputy and the two Secret Service agents fired their weapons and neutralized the threat. He is deceased at the scene.
That was Palm Beach County Sheriff Rick Bradshaw there.
Now, while Trump typically spends weekends there, authorities say he and his wife Melania were at the White House in Washington during this incident. The man's identity has not been released by law enforcement just yet, but it is understood he was from North Carolina and was reported missing by his family a few days ago. Investigators are now working to build a psychological profile of him and figure out his motive.
Yeah, it's far from the first time that Donald Trump has faced an attempt on his life. Obviously, we know he wasn't there. This person didn't get close. However, being able to get to the point that he did, if Donald Trump happened to be somewhere that he could see him, then, you don't know what would have happened. We know that in the 2024 election campaign, Donald Trump was clipped in the ear while speaking at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. And then there was a man who was aiming a rifle at Donald Trump as he was playing golf on a course not far from Mar-a-Lago. So it's clear as well in both those incidents, but also this latest one, that his Secret Service agents are really on the ball.
Sticking with the US, and the Australian government says it's examining all options after Donald Trump announced new tariffs on imports from all countries, including Australia. So for context, remember the 10% tariffs he rolled out in April last year on Liberation Day? Well, those were overturned by the US Supreme Court on Saturday, our time. The Supreme Court had found that the laws that the president was relying on were not laws that a president could rely on, rather were laws that belonged only to Congress. But it took the president no more than 24 hours after that ruling ruling, which he described as ridiculous and extraordinarily anti-American, to announce he would be reinstating them under different laws before raising them from 10% to 15%.
So what does this mean for us down under? Well, it is most likely to hit our beef, wine, agriculture and pharmaceutical producers the hardest. It makes it more expensive for US consumers to buy our stuff, so they're more likely to buy US goods over ours. And usually there are exemptions for things like beef. The US is our top beef export destination, and some critical minerals, but we're yet to know if that remains the case in this latest tranche of tariffs. We do know, though, that the Trade Minister, Don Farrell, is travelling to the US this week. He dropped a statement yesterday morning saying he was working closely with the embassy in Washington to assess the implications and examine all options. He went on to say Australia believes in free and fair trade and that the government has consistently advocated against these unjustified tariffs.
Back home, and the man who became a global hero after attacking one of the alleged Bondi terrorists and taking his gun has revealed what he said to the man. In his first sit-down interview in Australia since the tragedy on December 14 last year, Ahmed Al-Ahmed told 60 Minutes about the moment he leapt into action.
What did you say to him?
Start saying, motherfucker, stop what you're doing, and motherfucker, piece of shit, you know.
The 44-year-old tackled Sajid Akram to the ground, with many crediting his actions with saving lives.
He still has 2 bullets lodged in his shoulder as well, and he talked about, pretty much losing feeling in that hand of the arm that he was shot in. Ahmed was also asked about whether he regrets not shooting at Akram after taking his gun.
No, I didn't decide to shoot anything. My target was just to take the gun and stop him from killing a human being.
Yeah, and you know what? Looking back at that footage, you kind of see the moment that he does wrestle the gun off him and he puts his hands in the air immediately, which, fair enough, given how insane that moment would have been, but also the confusion from locals, from authorities. Yeah, you wouldn't want to be someone holding a gun on that day at all.
And he did a walkthrough of Bondi as well, and you could just see the response from not only locals, obviously, but tourists as well, people who know who he is, and, quite an incredible man.
And it's all over for another 4 years. The Winter Olympics closing ceremony is happening this morning to bring to an end Australia's most successful games ever. First-time medalist Cooper Woods, who won gold in the moguls, and Danielle Scott, who claimed silver in the aerials, have been given the honour of bearing the flags for Team Australia.
We finished 14th with 3 golds, 2 silvers and a bronze, as you said, our best ever, Chris. And it has prompted calls from Australia's chef de mission, Alyssa Camplin-Warner, that Aussie Winter Olympians should be getting more funding. She's warned that without a bigger investment, the medal haul we've seen in Italy this year will not be repeated. Now, I did try and find some stats or some numbers to back up, what's the disparity, right? Now, I couldn't find in my limited time super specific numbers, but I could find stats from the lead up to the Rio Olympics, which was in 2016. So in that 4-year cycle, 2012 to 2016, apparently the Summer Olympians and Paralympians got $340 million. Compare that to the Olympic Winter Institute's budget, which was sitting at around $1.1 million per year, according to some sources. Now, look, again, there's lots of things that go into funding. That's not the whole picture, but it gives you an idea of the kind of investment that our regular Olympians get compared to our Winter Olympians. So I don't know, would you support our more taxpayer dollars going to our snowboarders and our moguls skiers, Chris?
Well, you get me on taxpayers' dollars. But I will say this, as someone who came into this being like, oh, snooze, both of us were like, oh, snooze, the Winter Olympics. But I think it's very typical of us Australians to see that we're doing well in a particular field. And we're like, yes, we're getting around this. We love this. More funding for our Winter Olympians.
But that's exactly it. So maybe if we pour more money into it, we'll do better, and therefore we'll all of a sudden care more about the Winter Olympics.
Yes.
For the record, I don't think it's boring as such. It's just not my cup of tea, that's all.
Yep, ditto. Ditto there, friend, ditto there.
All right, that is it for the headlines today. Thank you for joining us. Next up, we are getting into Chris's deep dive, looking into private health insurance. Got a couple of sneaky hacks, but also explaining why we have to pay so much for it. Stick around, that's coming up next.
It's sold to us as the thing that'll help cover those physio sessions for your dodgy back, will chip in for your new glasses or fillings, or even get you in quicker for that knee reconstruction. It's also the box a lot of us tick to avoid that Medicare Levy Surcharge. Private health insurance. 15 million of us have it, and we're about to start paying more for it.
Look, I know this is going to be tough for households. Households are dealing with a range of pressures around cost of living, and I know for many of them private health insurers is one of those.
That's some of what the Health Minister Mark Butler had to say last week when he announced the 4.41% increase, which also happens to be the biggest jump we've seen in almost a decade. And it's an increase that's outpaced inflation. So you might be wondering whether it's even worth having private health insurance. Joining me now to unpack that, the increase, why it's happening, and the simple ways you can snag a better deal is consumer and money-saving expert Joel Gibson. Joel, welcome back to the briefing. I want to start with last week's announcement, the 4.41% increase. Talk us through it.
So the average across all the 30-odd health funds in the country, they take the average within each health fund of all the premium increases, and then they average all of those, and they get an average of 4.41%. But of course, if you've done high school statistics, you'll know that that's what we call a simple average, and it's not accounting for the fact that 3/4 of Australians are with just 4 health funds, the 4 biggest health funds. If you take the average of those 4 health funds, it's 5.1%. So actually, it's probably higher than 5% average for most Australians. And then when you look within each health fund, you're going to see some plans going up by over 10% and others going up by, lower amounts to get that average. So it's all going to depend on that letter you get from your health fund sometime in the next 3 weeks probably, which will outline exactly what's happening to your particular policy. But it is going to be, on average, the biggest increase in the last 10 years.
And as I understand it, that'll kick in from April the 1st. And in dollar terms, we're looking at anywhere from paying $100 extra a year to maybe $400. Now, this increase is something that's negotiated with the government. So the government and private health insurers negotiate this. Why is that?
Yeah, health insurance is a bizarre industry because it's supported by the federal government to the tune of around $7 billion in rebates each year. So essentially the government props up this industry, and in exchange for that, they reserve the right to sign off on the annual premium increases. When you look at home or car insurance or your energy retailers or whatever, they pick and choose what they're doing with their prices and the government has no say in it. But because they pour so much money into this health insurance industry in the form of rebates, they have a right, I suppose, to control to some extent that premium increase process. But that's not to say the government has its own way every time. They've been pretty apologetic this year and said they've gone back and forth several times with the health funds who initially wanted more than this. The government's kind of negotiated them down, but it is a negotiation process between the two parties.
Yeah, and one of those ways that it kind of supports the industry is through that Medicare Levy Surcharge, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I want to know some of the reasons the government has stated as to why we're seeing this increase. 2 that were pretty front and center last week was the growing cost of hospital care and our aging population. Can you unpack that a little further for us?
Look, inflation, as we know, has been pretty high the last few years. It's come down a bit, but it's just popped outside of that 2 to 3% range recently. So, it's between 3 and 4% general inflation. When you look at health services, particularly, slightly higher than that. It's more like 4 to 5%, depending on which aspect of the health system you look at. And so that's the argument. What's largely driving that is a few factors. One is obviously the demographic boom, the ageing population. The baby boomers are all getting older at the same time. There's a stat that says over 55s claim 4 times as much as under 55s on health insurance. So you're basically, to some extent sort of forced into the system using a series of sticks and carrots from the government when you're younger to try and cross-subsidise those claims that are made by older customers. And the deal is that when you get older, there'll be someone younger, hopefully, cross-subsidising you. So that's the way that health insurance works.
And that's where things like the Medicare Levy Surcharge come into the mix, right?
That's right. There's a couple of different ways the government kind of forces you into or tries to force you into health insurance. One of them is the Medicare Levy Surcharge. Now, everyone pays a Medicare levy at tax time based on their taxable income. But some people also pay what's called a Medicare Levy Surcharge, which is an extra 1 to 1.5%, depending on how much you earn. And if you have a hospital policy, you can avoid that Medicare Levy Surcharge. So it's a way of avoiding that extra tax. It kicks in about $101,000 taxable income for an individual. And so some people just decide they may as well get some basic health insurance rather than pay that extra money to the government.
When we're talking about some of the leaders in this space, we're talking about private health insurers like Medibank and Bupa. Their profits last year were between $500 to $741 million. Surely they can absorb some of these costs without passing it on to people like us, right?
Well, yes, I think they could. And I think customers feel like they could as well. But this is the way, businesses tend to put shareholders first. And look, we've just seen Medibank recently report its most recent results. Revenue was up 5.5%. Operating profit was up 6%. Net profit after tax, almost $300 million. Health funds are doing pretty well. They actually had a really good pandemic. Health funds were in real trouble. We were talking about a death spiral in health insurance where people were dropping their cover and there wasn't going to be enough of those younger people to cross-subsidise the older people claiming. We were talking about that before the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit and actually more people took out health insurance because they were worried about their health. So they've had a pretty good few years and it's pretty rough when you're getting a 5% increase on your policy, on a policy which a lot of us never really use.
Yeah, and to those post-COVID numbers, interestingly, we've also kind of seen this trend emerge of Aussies leaving their top cover and choosing for lower covers because of this cost of living crisis. And we've just mentioned earlier how this increase is outpacing inflation. So it makes perfect sense that some Aussies are choosing to just pay less when it comes to insurance. It is, though, Joel, it's hard to feel like this isn't a big old scam. The way that we've spoken about it, the way that we've been speaking about it, I'm curious to know, is there any merit in ditching your private health cover entirely and just putting those payments into something like a savings account instead?
Yeah, look, a lot of people do describe health insurance in that way, and I can understand where they're coming from. I'd say a few things about that. First of all, no one wakes up in the morning and thinks, I want to go and buy some insurance, right? It's a grudge purchase. It's something you buy so that if something does go horribly wrong, you won't suffer catastrophic loss. So, your house burns down or your car gets written off or you have to have some really serious kind of medical procedures, right? So if you're not using it, that's probably a good thing. It probably means you're healthy. And when you get a bit older, over 55, and you do start using it, you often hear people saying, oh, thank God I had my health insurance. So that is just something to keep in mind, is it's mainly a product you're going to use in your older years, but they do put you into the system or force you into the system early so that you can kind of pay it forward. But I think self-insurance is definitely an option. I know a lot of people who've done it and done it successfully. And the risk with self-insurance, of course, is what if something happens in the first couple of years after you start doing that and you don't have enough in the kitty yet to cover a very large medical expense. Of course, we have a very good public health system. When it comes to elective surgeries, sometimes you can wait 6 months or a year to get elective surgeries in the public system. And also some people are prepared to pay health insurance just so that they have some control over who their doctor is. So those are the things that people generally, keep their policy for or take out a policy for. But it's not compulsory. We've got a good public health system in Australia. Self-insurance is definitely an option, and so is relying on Medicare if you just can't afford, private health insurance. It's a bit like a private school fees. You don't have to pay them. You can choose to if you can afford it, but don't feel that that it's compulsory. It's not.
In terms of those other options that we could be exploring, Joel, this is where your money-saving expertise comes into the mix. What are some of the ways that someone listening can save money on their policy right now? Something that I learned that shook me to my core is this thing called a loyalty penalty. There was some analysis that came out showing that long-term customers pay something like 29% higher premiums the longer they stay with their private health insurer. What should people be doing now given this increase?
Yeah, that was interesting research, I think, from Compare the Market, where they looked at people who'd stayed loyal with their health fund for 10 years and they compared what they were paying to people who'd recently switched health funds, and there was a 29% difference. So I think that shows if you just stick at it and never shop around, never switch, you will probably end up paying more than somebody who's regularly looking for a better deal. And what's happened over the past few years is that the deals, if you're prepared to switch your health insurance, have become more and more generous. In fact, they've doubled. And now you can get sometimes 10, 12, 14 weeks free when you switch your health insurance, or, hundreds of dollars cash back, $400, sometimes $500 cash back. So it is really worth looking. It's a valid way, and it's actually, you're protected legally in terms of there are some things called the portability provisions. And what that means simply is just that if you've served waiting periods on your current policy, you don't have to serve them again if you move to another health fund, as long as you move to the same level of cover. silver to silver, gold to gold. So just make sure when you're switching across that they're going to honour your waiting periods, and then it's really seamless. So people need to know that. If you're not prepared to switch or you don't want to for some reason, you can look at a downgrade. Just be careful that you know what you are trading out, obviously. But the difference between the average gold policy and the average silver policy is $4,000 a year. And of course, like any insurance, you can increase your excess sometimes to save on your premium. You can think about, if you're a couple, do you both need the same level of cover? Because if you don't, you could split into 2 singles policies, for example, and maybe save significant money on one of them who only needs bronze cover and the other one can keep their gold cover or whatever. So there's any number of different ways you can kind of look for savings.
Excellent advice as always, and thank you so much for jumping on the line to unpack this whole world of private health insurance for us, Joel.
Thanks, Chris.
That was consumer and money-saving expert Joel Gibson speaking with me there, and that is it for this episode of The Briefing. If you learned something new in this episode or you just enjoyed it, why not flick it over to a mate, and while you're there, leave us a rate and a review. I'm Chris Spyrou. I'll catch you next time.